The story of Judith begins in a time when hope seemed like a fading memory. The people of Bethulia found themselves surrounded by the vast Assyrian army led by the ruthless commander Holofernes. His reputation for destruction spread far and wide, and every nation that had tried to resist him had been crushed under the weight of his soldiers. For the men, women, and children trapped within the walls of Bethulia, the sight of tents stretching endlessly across the horizon was enough to stir fear deeper than words could express. The siege pressed heavily upon them. Days turned into weeks. Water supplies ran low and food grew scarce. Mothers held their hungry children close, while fathers stared at the gates, powerless against the army outside. The air was thick with despair, and whispers of surrender began to rise. How could a small city resist such a force? The Assyrian banners stood like shadows over their hope, and every sunrise brought the same haunting reality. Survival seemed impossible. This was more than a military crisis. It was a crisis of faith. The people of Bethulia wrestled not only with their hunger and fear, but with the question of whether God still heard their cries. Had he abandoned them? Was he still the God who parted seas and brought down walls? Or were those stories only memories of the past? For many, doubt felt louder than faith, and compromise seemed easier than trust. Yet in that despair lay the stage for something extraordinary. History shows us again and again that the darkest nights often prepare the way for the brightest dawns. The people did not yet know that God was about to raise up a deliverer, someone they would least expect, someone overlooked by power and position. In the silence of their hopelessness, a plan was already unfolding, one that would reveal the strength of faith when everything else had failed. Judith's story is not only about survival, it is about discovering what faith truly looks like when the world closes in on every side. It invites us to see that even when all seems lost, courage can rise from the most unexpected places, and God's purposes can shine through the weakest of vessels. This is not just an ancient tale. It is a reminder that impossible moments are often the soil where miracles take root. If you enjoy hearing stories like this that inspire, strengthen faith, and remind us of the power of courage, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps bring more of these timeless stories to life. Judith's story begins not in the noise of battle, nor in the courts of leaders, but in the stillness of widowhood. After the passing of her husband Manasseh, she withdrew into a life of prayer and discipline, quietly shaping a strength unseen by the world. She lived in her home at Bethulia with simplicity, clothed not in finery but in humility, fasting regularly and turning her heart continually toward God. Her days were marked not by applause or recognition, but by hidden devotion, the kind of life that seems invisible to many, yet precious in the eyes of heaven. Her community likely saw her as a woman of mourning, one who had lost her place in society's structure. Widows in ancient Israel often faced vulnerability, with little power to influence the course of events around them. Judith's quiet life reflected no outward claim to leadership, no position of authority, and no army at her command. Yet within her solitude, a different kind of power was being formed. Her strength was not sharpened on the battlefield, but forged in silence, in self-control, in an unwavering trust that God still held every detail of her life in his hands. Judith's devotion was radical in its consistency. When others might have been consumed with bitterness over loss, she turned her grief into prayer. When despair could have driven her into passivity, she trained her spirit through fasting and reliance on God. The years of solitude shaped her into someone resilient, someone able to listen for God's voice even when the noise of the world tried to drown it out. She did not wait for recognition to validate her worth. Instead, her life was a testimony that unseen obedience is never wasted. In many ways, Judith mirrored the forgotten ones of history, those who seem to live in the background, unnoticed by the powerful, yet held in the gaze of God. Her example speaks to the quiet souls who feel overlooked, to those who labor without applause, to those who endure sorrow in silence. The story reminds us that strength is not always cultivated in grand arenas, but often in the hidden places where the heart chooses faith over despair, trust over bitterness, obedience over neglect. The shaping of Judith's character was not accidental. It prepared her for a moment when her voice would need to be strong, when her courage would need to stand unshaken, and when her wisdom would redirect a nation's fate. The very qualities that seemed small, prayer, fasting, discipline, would become the weapons that no enemy could anticipate. It is in the shadows, after all, that the foundations of true strength are laid. Even before her name would echo across the land, Judith's life had already become a vessel of God's design. Her story reminds us that one does not have to hold a title or wield visible power to be positioned for extraordinary impact. Sometimes the greatest acts of deliverance begin in the heart of someone the world hardly notices. Judith's life in the shadows was a story of faithfulness without an audience. Yet it was precisely this hidden strength that would soon become the turning point in Israel's darkest hour. The widow, unarmed and uncelebrated, was being prepared for a role that no general, no elder, and no warrior could fulfill. While Judith prayed in solitude, the leaders of Bethulia found themselves overwhelmed by despair. The siege dragged on, and supplies grew scarcer by the day. Uzziah, along with other elders and warriors, felt the crushing weight of responsibility. They looked upon the faces of their starving people and saw hope slipping away like water through their fingers. These were men trained to be strong, yet even they began to waver. The murmurs of surrender became louder, not only among the weary townsfolk, but also among those expected to inspire confidence. Hunger gnawed at the resolve of warriors, and the sight of a Syrian might press hard against their spirits. When leaders falter, the entire community feels the tremor. The pillars that held up the morale of Bethulia began to crack, and fear seeped in through those fractures. Uzziah and the elders made a desperate choice. They declared that if God did not deliver them within a set number of days, they would surrender to the Assyrians. Their words revealed both their humanity and their frailty, for they sought to place conditions on the Almighty. They struggled to believe that deliverance was still possible, and in their weakness, they leaned toward compromise. This was not merely a political crisis, it was a crisis of faith. Leaders who once stood tall in the confidence of God's promises now bent beneath the pressure of visible reality. Their collapse echoed the struggles of many hearts across time, when faith collides with fear, when trust feels like a burden too heavy to carry, and when surrender appears more realistic than perseverance. Into this moment of weakness stepped Judith, uninvited but unstoppable. Her voice pierced the haze of despair, calling the leaders back to what they had forgotten. She reminded them that faith is not measured by the convenience of outcomes, but by unwavering trust in God's sovereignty. She rebuked them gently yet firmly, challenging their decision to test God with timelines and ultimatums. Her words cut deeper than any sword, for they exposed the heart of the issue. Doubt had overtaken courage. The widow who had lived in silence now spoke with authority, shaming the hesitation of those who should have been the first to inspire faith. Judith refused to allow fear to dictate Israel's future. She stood before leaders and warriors and proclaimed what they had forgotten, that the God of their fathers was not bound by time, nor intimidated by armies, nor limited by human weakness. In that moment, the fragile faith of Bethulia was confronted by a woman who refused to let despair have the final word. Judith's courage became the spark that reignited hope, a reminder that even when the brave falter, God often raises up voices from unexpected places to call his people back to trust. After her confrontation with the leaders, Judith's resolve took shape in a daring plan. She would not wait for others to act. She would step into the role that faith demanded of her. But her strategy was unlike anything the warriors of Bethulia could have imagined. She chose to prepare herself not with armor or weapons, but with beauty. Judith bathed, anointed herself with precious oils, and dressed in her finest garments, the kind she had not worn since her husband's death. She adorned herself with jewels and carefully arranged her hair. What might have seemed an act of vanity was in truth a weapon sharpened for battle. Her beauty, once concealed in mourning, became a vessel of divine purpose. The decision was not driven by pride, but by insight. Judith understood the arrogance of her enemy. Holofernes and his men would never suspect danger from a woman who appeared weak, delicate, and adorned for pleasure. Her outward appearance was not deception for personal gain, but strategy for a higher calling. She was stepping into the enemy's camp, clothed in vulnerability, yet armed with wisdom and courage. Her transformation carried symbolic meaning. God often uses what the world dismisses as insignificant to accomplish his greatest works. The very qualities overlooked by men, beauty, humility, gentleness, became the instruments through which deliverance would come. Judith embodied this paradox, reminding all who would hear her story that the power of God often flows through unexpected vessels. By adorning herself, Judith also mirrored the spiritual truth that preparation matters. Just as she dressed for her mission, hearts must also be prepared when called into moments of courage. Her garments symbolized more than physical beauty. They reflected readiness, intention, and a surrender of herself into God's hands. Her beauty was not meant to glorify her, but to serve as a tool for God's glory. She would use it not to entice, but to disarm, not to elevate herself, but to position herself where no man could go. The Assyrians saw only a widow stepping out of her city gates, but heaven saw a warrior clothed for a battle that would reshape history. Judith's choice to wield beauty as her weapon stands as a striking reminder that God often turns weakness into strength, fragility into force, and the underestimated into the unstoppable. The widow who fasted and prayed in shadows now walked into the light of her calling, carrying nothing but faith, wisdom, and the boldness to let God use every part of who she was. Judith left Bethulia and descended toward the enemy encampment, accompanied by her maid. With every step, the danger grew sharper, yet her composure never wavered. She walked with the calm assurance of one who knew her strength did not rest in human might, but in the unseen presence of God. Around her, thousands of soldiers filled the valley, banners of Assyria rising like a forest of intimidation. But Judith entered as though light itself had stepped into the heart of darkness. The Assyrian guards stopped her, suspicious yet intrigued. They saw a woman clothed in beauty, her garments gleaming, her face radiant with courage. When questioned, she spoke with measured words, claiming to bring knowledge that would aid their master. Her speech was graceful yet firm, disarming suspicion with wisdom and convincing the guards to escort her deeper into the camp. As she passed through the ranks of the enemy, whispers followed her. Warriors hardened by violence paused to gaze at her, astonished that such a figure would walk into their midst. She carried herself not with fear, but with dignity, her presence unsettling because it seemed untouched by the terror that had subdued so many before her. Eventually, she stood before Holofernes, the commander whose reputation for cruelty had silenced cities. He looked upon her not as a threat, but as a prize. Her beauty captured his attention, and her words captured his curiosity. Judith spoke carefully, weaving her speech with just enough truth to seem convincing, yet guided by wisdom that concealed her true intent. She presented herself as one who had abandoned Bethulia's doomed cause, claiming to know the weaknesses of her people, suggesting she could guide the Assyrians to victory. Holofernes, blinded by pride and seduced by the thought of possessing such a woman, welcomed her presence and granted her favor. He believed he had gained an ally, when in truth he had opened his camp to the very instrument of his downfall. Judith remained poised, never rushing, never betraying her purpose. She ate little, choosing only the provisions she had brought, and prayed silently even as she spoke with confidence. Her strength lay not in deceit for selfish gain, but in her absolute reliance on the God who guided her steps. The closer she moved to the heart of the enemy's power, the stronger her faith burned within her. In the camp of her adversary, Judith became a living contrast. Surrounded by violence, she radiated peace. In the presence of arrogance, she carried humility. Among warriors who trusted in the sword, she embodied a trust in something far greater. Each word she spoke, each gesture she made, was part of a divine plan unfolding through her obedience. Judith's entrance into the enemy's camp stands as one of history's most remarkable displays of courage. It reveals the strength of a soul walking unshaken through the valley of death, armed not with armies, but with conviction, not with blades, but with faith. In the shadow of Holofernes' throne, Judith prepared the ground for the deliverance of her people, proving that light can indeed walk fearlessly into the deepest darkness. As night fell over the Assyrian camp, silence slowly replaced the noise of the day. Torches flickered against the darkness, and drunken laughter echoed from the tent of Holofernes, who had gathered with his men for a feast. Judith remained present, her calm composure masking the storm of thoughts within her. She was in the very heart of danger, yet she carried herself as though she were untouched by fear. Every step, every word, every breath was guided by a faith that anchored her soul firmly in the purpose for which she had come. Holofernes, consumed by pride and indulgence, drank heavily until his body could no longer resist the weight of wine. His boasts gave way to slurred speech and eventually to the silence of deep, unguarded slumber. Around him, his servants withdrew, leaving their master in the company of the woman they believed he had conquered. The tent that had been filled with arrogance and drunken laughter now lay heavy with stillness. Judith knew the moment she had been waiting for had arrived. She stood over him, the embodiment of courage clothed in prayer. The sight before her was both terrifying and strangely humbling. The man who had threatened to annihilate her people, who had crushed countless lives beneath his command, now lay helpless, his strength dissolved by his own excess. It was here that Judith's resolve was tested, for the act she was about to commit was not driven by personal vengeance, but by divine mission. Judith reached for Holofernes' sword, its weight cold and foreign in her hands. She lifted it with determination, steadying herself with the knowledge that she was not acting alone. Her arm may have held the blade, but her courage was upheld by the God she had trusted through years of fasting, prayer, and solitude. With two decisive strokes, she severed the head of the enemy commander, cutting off not only his life, but the very symbol of oppression that had terrified her nation. Her maid, prepared for this moment, helped secure the head in a sack, and together they slipped quietly out of the tent. The camp around them remained unaware, lost in slumber, oblivious to the act of deliverance that had just taken place within their own stronghold. The darkness of night shielded their movements, and the silence of heaven seemed to embrace their steps as they carried the trophy of victory back toward Bethulia. The symbolism of that act stretched far beyond the battlefield. Judith had not merely slain a man, she had struck at the root of arrogance and violence that exalted itself against God's people. The head of Holofernes became a powerful image of how the proud are humbled, how the mighty fall, and how deliverance can come from the most unexpected source. What swords and shields could not accomplish, the faith and obedience of one woman had achieved. The night of deliverance was not marked by the clash of armies, but by the quiet courage of a widow who chose to trust when others faltered. Her hands had performed an act that changed the course of history, yet her heart remained fixed not on her own glory, but on the preservation of her people and the faithfulness of her God. That night revealed a truth that echoes through time. Even when surrounded by overwhelming darkness, one act of courage fueled by faith can break the grip of tyranny. Judith had walked into the enemy's camp unarmed, and she had walked out carrying the symbol of victory. The night that seemed to belong to the Assyrians had been claimed by Israel's God through the obedience of his servant. As dawn approached, the people of Bethulia stirred in their misery, still trapped within walls of despair. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, and fear pressed heavily upon their minds. They expected another day of waiting, another day of hopeless endurance. What they did not know was that their deliverance was already walking toward them, carried in the hands of the widow they had underestimated. Judith and her maid entered the city quietly, but the burden they carried was too extraordinary to remain hidden. The people gathered, astonished at the sight before them. Judith lifted the head of Holofernes and revealed to them what had taken place in the night. The gasps of disbelief turned into shouts of amazement, and those shouts swelled into a roar of celebration. The very image that had once inspired terror now inspired courage. The elders who had once wavered in their faith fell to their knees, overwhelmed not only by the sight, but by the rebuke of their own doubt. They praised God for raising up Judith, for using her courage to deliver a nation. Her solitary act had broken the grip of fear, proving that surrender was never the answer when trust in God remained. The widow, who had once lived in obscurity, now stood at the center of her people's gratitude, not because she had sought recognition, but because her obedience had brought them life. The people rejoiced, yet their rejoicing was mingled with awe. They had witnessed not only the downfall of a man, but the triumph of faith against overwhelming odds. Their celebration echoed across the hills, a sound that carried far beyond their walls. It reached the ears of the Assyrian soldiers, who, discovering their leader dead and their camp thrown into chaos, found themselves gripped by panic. The Assyrians, once so confident in their invincibility, now scattered in confusion. Leaderless and terrified, they abandoned their positions, and what had once been a threat of annihilation dissolved into rout. Israel's victory came not through the raising of an army, but through the collapse of an enemy, undone by the courage of one. As Judith stood among her people, she did not claim glory for herself. She directed their praise to the God who had delivered them, reminding them that victory belonged to Him alone. Her presence became a living testimony that faith, even when carried by one individual, can change the destiny of an entire nation. The return of Judith to Bethulia was more than a moment of triumph. It was the restoration of hope. What had once been a city weighed down by despair was now lifted up by joy, and the memory of hunger and fear was replaced with the strength of renewed faith. The people learned through Judith that one person's trust in God can ignite a fire strong enough to push back the darkness pressing in on all sides. Her walk back into Bethulia marked the turning point of a story that had seemed lost. With each step she carried not only the head of Holofernes, but the assurance that no enemy, no matter how vast, could overcome the courage of one who believed. The days following Holofernes' death were filled with transformation. News of the Assyrian commander's downfall spread quickly, and the once terrifying army dissolved in fear. Israel was spared, Bethulia was free, and the people found themselves living in a reality they had scarcely dared to imagine. What despair had stolen from them, faith had restored. The elders and leaders gathered the people to give thanks. Their voices rose in songs of praise, and their hearts bowed in humility. They recognized that the victory had not come by human design or military might, but by the hand of God working through the obedience of one faithful woman. The memory of their doubt now stood in sharp contrast to the triumph that had unfolded before them. Judith became a figure of honor, her name spoken with reverence across Israel. Yet she did not seek wealth, nor did she grasp for a throne or authority. Instead, she returned to the quiet life she had always lived, choosing to dwell once again in prayer and devotion. Her greatness lay not in claiming power, but in surrendering her life fully to the purposes of God. The restoration of the nation was not only political, but spiritual. The people who had once considered surrender now renewed their covenant with the God who had saved them. Their faith, once weak and wavering, grew strong again, nourished by the reminder that their history had always been written by the miracles of God, not the strength of men. Judith's decision to return to obscurity after such a moment of triumph revealed the purity of her character. She had acted not for her own recognition, but out of devotion to her people and to her God. Her story reminded Israel that true greatness is not found in acclaim or position, but in obedience to the divine call, regardless of how small or hidden it may seem. Her life became a testimony for generations. Parents told their children of the widow who saved a nation, of the woman who walked into the enemy's camp and returned with victory in her hands. The story of Judith became not only history but identity, a reminder that God's people are never without hope, no matter how overwhelming the enemy may appear. The restoration of Israel through Judith's courage left an enduring mark. It was not only the liberation from Assyrian threat, but the renewal of confidence in the God who delivers in ways beyond human imagination. The people learned again that despair is never the final word when faith remains alive. Judith, the widow once hidden in shadows, had brought light to an entire nation. Her obedience became the turning point that restored not just her city, but the heart of her people, drawing them back to the one who had never forsaken them. The story of Judith does not fade into the pages of history as a mere tale of survival. It lives on as a powerful reminder of what faith, courage, and obedience can accomplish. She was not a queen, nor a general, nor a figure draped in worldly authority. She was a widow who lived quietly, often unseen by those around her. Yet when the moment arrived, she rose with a courage that shook an empire and restored a nation. Her legacy is not about titles or status, but about the truth that God chooses ordinary lives to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Judith teaches us that the warrior spirit is not defined by strength of arm or the weight of weapons. It is defined by the strength of the heart that refuses to surrender to fear. Each person who hears her story is invited to see themselves in her courage. Whether young or old, man or woman, each soul carries the potential to rise with faith when the world presses in with darkness. Her life is a call to believe that the very places where you feel small or hidden may be the very places where God is shaping you for something far greater. Her rebuke of leaders who had lost heart echoes into our own struggles. How often do we look to others for confidence, only to see them falter? Judith's voice calls us not to rely on the strength of men, but to fix our trust on the God who never fails. Her decision to use beauty as a strategy reminds us that nothing is wasted when surrendered to divine purpose. Her entrance into the enemy camp shows us that light can walk straight into the heart of darkness without fear. And her act of deliverance reveals that even the mightiest oppressor can be brought low when faith stands firm. Judith's return to her simple life after such a victory is perhaps her greatest lesson. She did not chase glory, riches, or honor. She showed that true greatness is found in obedience, not in recognition. Her story tells us that the victories we achieve through faith are not meant to elevate us, but to glorify the one who strengthens us. In this, Judith becomes not only a hero of her people, but a mirror for us today. She shows that living with devotion, humility, and courage is itself the highest calling. The warrior spirit of Judith is not locked in the past. It breathes into every heart that chooses trust over fear, courage over compromise, and obedience over hesitation. Her story invites us to rise in our own moments of challenge, to believe that no situation is too desperate, no enemy too great, no night too dark for God's light to shine through us. Her legacy whispers into every soul that feels small and forgotten. You are never powerless when your heart is anchored in faith. And so, as we look back at the story of Judith, we are reminded that history is shaped not only by kings and generals, but by those who dare to believe when belief seems impossible. Her story does not end with her, but continues wherever faith rises in the face of fear. It continues in you, in the choices you make, and in the courage you carry into the battles of your own life. If Judith's story has inspired you today, I encourage you to take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe so you won't miss future videos that bring to life powerful stories of faith and courage. Like this video, if it touched your heart, leave a comment to share your thoughts and pass this story along to your friends and family so they too can be encouraged. Together, we can keep spreading these timeless lessons that strengthen, uplift, and remind us of the power of faith.